If everybody can have their seats. I would like you to welcome you to New Orleans. I'm glad you could find the new hall. I'm Laura Koenig. I'm a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. This session is called Creating Inclusive and Diverse Field and Lab Environments Within the Geosciences. This is something I think that many of us in the field are concerned about and want to hear more about. I certainly have been around different things that were both limiting diversity and inclusiveness, and I wanted more tools. And our goal for today is to give us more tools. How this format is going to start is we're going to have 2 speakers and then a panel discussion, and then we will open it up for audience questions, and we hope to have good dialogue. We have organized this session with Dr. Robin Bell from Lamont Doherty, Dr. Meredith Hastings from Brown University, and Dr. Melissa Burt from Colorado State University. We will open our keynote speakers with Marcia McNutt. Marcia is currently the president of the National Academies, and for this audience from 2000 to 2002, she served as the AGU president, so she's a past president of AGU. We are looking forward to her presentation.
All right, thanks very much, Laura, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to lovely New Orleans. So this morning, I'm going to talk about mostly the challenges with welcoming a more inclusive and diverse group into the field sciences and the special challenges involved in that. Here we go. Most of my talk is going to concentrate on the issues involved with women, although I think the case can be made that if the geosciences become a more welcoming field for women, many of the solutions I'm going to propose are actually very applicable for all dimensions of inclusivity, more than just women. So the questions I'm going to address are: how frequently do women in scientific fields encounter sexual harassment? What are the effects of that harassment on women's career choices? And how do we reduce or hopefully eliminate harassment in the classrooms, labs, and primarily I'm going to concentrate on field settings. So here are some data that were published in 2014 in the journal PLOS One, and many of you are probably aware of this study that was done by Cleary et al. But I like the graphic way that they presented the results, showing with these blue and red dots the results. And basically what they found in their surveys were that 67% of respondents had experienced harassment in the field, and that greater than 20% had experienced sexual assault. So that's a pretty staggering number of very negative experiences. That greater than 90% of the women who reported sexual harassment were trainees at the time of that harassment, and that the perpetrator was most likely a superior, not a peer. It was someone who was in a position of authority over them. And I think the bottom line, when you look at the far right columns, in terms of the reporting, whether they reported the contact and how few dots are populating those boxes on the right, that what the authors of this report concluded, and let me quote from it, was that the victims were victims twice. Once when they were harassed, and then again by being ignored, ostracized, or dismissed. So the question is not just about the harassment itself, but the lack of recourse for those being harassed. Now, so the issue here is that sexual harassment in science is real. In American Association of University survey of 27 institutions found that 62% of undergraduates and 51% of graduate female student respondents reported experiencing some sort of sexual harassment. For undergraduates, the harasser was more likely to be a peer. But for graduate students, the harasser was more likely to be a faculty member. And routes for redress were largely not well known, and routes for redress were largely not effective. And therein lies the problem. Now, there's more specific data for the ocean sciences, which comes from a study of Yoder and Rizzoli, which is now fairly outdated. It's a 2006 study that looked at joint program students from Woods Hole, and half of those students described unwanted sexual advances, but very few of them were reported. And what they concluded was that the leaky pipeline of students advancing to senior levels, of women advancing to senior levels, was contributing to the problem. Whereas in ocean sciences, even at that time, many women had been students. Very few of them were actually in senior levels, and for that reason, very few women were actually advising the younger women, and so they felt that that was part of the problem, why there was still a high number of women being harassed and few paths for reporting the problems. Now, why does science have a special problem? I've had people say to me, some very high-level people in science say, well, harassment happens in banking, and it happens in law, and it happens in business. Why is science so different? Well, I think science really is very different, and this is why it's different. Women are very underrepresented compared to many other avenues of that people might choose to make their career. There's still the indentured servant model of student advisor, which makes women very dependent on their advisor for their support, for advice, in a way that is not common in many other fields of advancement. Frequently in the geosciences, people are away from their normal 9 to 5 routine for field work, meetings, workshops, etc. That students are dependent long-term on their more senior mentors. It's not just you graduate and then you go off and have a nice life. Those mentors continue to write letters for you. They have an outsized impact on your career path for a very long time. They might be asked to nominate you for awards, etc. And the last one here, I think, is also important, though it may not be unique to science, that complaints, investigations, and their outcomes are often kept confidential. There's this secrecy that makes it very difficult to know who are the bad apples and how bad it might be. So let's talk about the field setting. in particular. Many field settings are very isolated. They tend to be unreal. Unreal almost in the Las Vegas way. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You know, there's a little bit of this attitude that when you go out into the field, it's, you know, anything goes because this isn't home, this isn't real. You know, this is a place that's kind of like the fake Eiffel Tower in Disneyland or whatever. Women are outnumbered very much in most cases. There are unique cultures and customs that are prevalent out in the field, and those unique cultures and customs grew up in generally a totally male environment, and the women are expected to fit into them. You know, you remember equator crossing ceremonies where you're supposed to get your head shaved and things like this. These are not female-friendly customs that came up. Normal recourses for reporting are not available. Most women feel that complaining jeopardizes future funding because if you complain about someone, and let's suppose it doesn't go very far, the person you complained about could very likely get your proposal to review at a future time, and they're not going to feel very friendly about giving you a good review. And also, there's the more general concern about being viewed as a victim could impact your career prospects. And that, I've heard, is another real problem. This was one story that was published in the Washington Post in 2015 from a marine science student who decided to become part of the ship's crew. And she says, as a graduate student, I was elated when senior students invited me to conduct research aboard the same science research vessel christened by Sylvia Earle, a female pioneer of marine biology. I loved the job despite another colleague's increasingly crude comments about my body, all of which seemed benign until he came into my room one night while I was sleeping and groped me. When I complained, my shifts were cut. When I asked while my job duties were being altered, I was barred from attending dive school and harassed further. But I kept doing my job. I wanted to be as tough as any other Gulf Coast sailor out there. So, you know, these are real stories of real people. So this leads me to the question, are we selecting for the best and brightest, or simply the toughest and most determined? And I'm worried that there are bodies literally laying by the roadside of very brilliant women who couldn't make it in the field because of this, all of the things that happened to them, whether they were outright harassment or microaggressions. And those that are up here today are just the tough ones that toughed it out and put up with it. And that's not what it should be. It should be an even playing field for everyone. Now, finally, we're seeing some consequences. I'm sure there's no one in this room that doesn't know about this story, about Boston University finding that one of their professors actually sexually harassed a graduate student. And what was amazing about this story was it was 2 decades after the harassment that they're holding him accountable. But what is also amazing about it was that the woman in the case felt that she had to wait 2 decades until after she got tenure at her institution to bring the case forward because she feared repercussions, and that she waited until she got tenure and then she felt, I'm safe now. But prior to that, she felt she couldn't bring the case forward because she was worried about her own career. So we are seeing now some repercussions, but as I say, this is a brave person who kept this inside and lived with this for nearly 2 decades until she got tenure. Now, there was an interesting Washington Post series just on Saturday that I pulled up that was asking top people around the country, what would you do right now to stop harassment across all fields? And Jackie Speier, who's a congressman from California, said she's introducing the Me Too Act in Congress. And she's saying the Me Too Act will make all congressional payouts public. If there's a congressman that needs to use public funds to pay off someone else because of their harassing behavior, that will become public. No more private, under-the-table hush money paid to people. So she wants to make that public. That's what her thing is that she's going to do. Someone from a university contributed to this and said, universities, don't backslide on Title IX. Now, I know a lot of people think Title IX is what's given university female athletes more resources, but Title IX is actually one of the best tools in the university repertoire for getting equal status for women. It says, no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Because sexual harassment is all about inequality. And Title IX, the Title IX office is a very important tool at every university. So don't backslide on Title IX at universities. And for all leaders here, enforce discipline. Do not tolerate crude jokes, off-color language, lack of respect for all team members, any kind of sexist behavior, racial jokes, anything of that sort. I remember a time back when I was a beginning student, there were many women who felt, I gotta be one of the guys to fit in. No, you don't. You be yourself. You be yourself whatever you are. And all leaders, you allow every person to be themselves to fit in and enforce discipline. Discipline means that everyone toes the line and everyone shows respect for everyone else. Parents, teach consent from a young age. Okay, I have grandchildren who are just entering the terrible twos. You all know the terrible twos is all about no. And we spend a long time trying to teach kids not to say no. But there's a time that comes when we have to teach kids that when it comes to themselves, no is okay to say. And I remember when my kids were preteens, one thing is they had these 1,000-pound horses. And they taught 1,000-pound horses that they had personal space. And those horses had to respect their personal space, even if they had apple treats and cookies and things like that. And once they taught those horses to respect their personal space, I'll tell you, they had no problem with teenage boys. They found teenage boys were a piece of cake in terms of wrangling them and teaching them their boundaries. So just a shout out to the AGU for the actions they're taking. AGU is a front runner with the fact that they have included harassment as a form of scientific misconduct. This is a first, as far as I know. I know of no other group that has defined harassment as scientific misconduct. And they include on their website resources for that. And then finally, institutional solutions, you can read them here, I'm running out of time. But just to say, we need to develop community means to prevent harassers from being passed along. Just like the Me Too Act of Congressman Speier, How do we find out about these secret payouts? I am sick and tired of institutions putting their financial gain because they've got some faculty member or some researcher who's their rainmaker, and they're willing to pay out $50,000, $100,000, and keep it under attorney-client privilege, and they're willing to have non-disclosures and allow that person to do it again and again and again because it's in their own financial interests. We've got to stop that. We need women on the board of directors. We need women leading those institutions to stop that kind of behavior. And finally, I also spoke to UNILS recently and just talked about some of the difficulties when we've got shared facilities. Shipboard offenders. One institution owns the ship, you've got an offender from another institution. This can lead to jurisdictional problems. And again, because I'm running out of time, I'll just finally say we've got a National Academy study on this issue of harassment. And here's the statement of task. I welcome any comments from anyone on this study. Please send them to me, McNutt at nas.edu, on your good ideas for solutions. Thank you very much.
Can we take one question for Dr. McNutt?
Yes.
And we'll repeat it into the mic.
Yeah. Yeah, just say it and I'll repeat it for, yeah. Okay, so Andrea Donnellan has a question about Title IX, that the complaint is filed under the complainer, not the complainant. It's filed under the person being accused. Okay, so is anyone here an expert on Title IX? Because I am not. Okay, good. We have someone who knows Title IX.
I'm not an expert on Title IX, and I don't know if this was legally mandated by maybe the Dear Colleague letter that came out of Title IX that really focused the shift on addressing sexual harassment and assault to universities. But I do know that it's definitely common practice for institutions to file complaints on the name of the person putting the complaint, not on the name of the harasser. And so that it is nearly impossible to build a case for serial harassment because there's not a record, right? If you were to look up complaints, you're just going to have find the name of the person who's putting forward the complaint. So that's definitely something that needs to change.
Yeah. Good question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next up, our speaker is Dr. Sandy Starkweather. She is from the University of Colorado in the Cooperative Institute for Environmental, for Research. I'm in this institution too, the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences, Ceres as we call it. Dr. Starkweather has worked to create one of the largest collaborative networks with NOAA, with the the Interagency Arctic Research Program, IARPIC. She has also run for many years before she did that job a very inclusive and diverse station in the center of the Greenland ice sheet. And I hope she will talk a little bit about that. Sandy.
Yellow is 16. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'll get started while they're pulling the presentation up. I'm not as eloquent to be able to speak off the top of my head, so I have notes. So my co-authors, Renee Crane of the National Science Foundation, Kim Derry, who's sitting here, of Polar Field Services, And I would like to thank the conveners for including us today, and especially for having the vision to pull together this really important discussion. Dr. McNutt summarized many things that thankfully I don't have to summarize, but we've seen the headlines, we've seen the statistics from the research like the SAFE study, and they're truly horrifying. This widespread evidence of abuses in field environments, such as sexual harassment by those in authority, in particular against the more vulnerable, really undermines our institutions. And I'm going to be using a lot of quotes, so enjoy reading the quotes and looking at the pictures. I won't read, or I include a lot of quotes, I won't read them. So what we know is we can't expect, and we shouldn't expect, career-long diversity in the geosciences if we can't make our field camps, research vessels, and laboratories harassment-free for all participants. Even as sustained diversity is contingent on robust principles of inclusion, and I show the continuum here. So diversity is contingent upon inclusion. Inclusion is contingent upon, even synonymous with, harassment-free environments. If you don't feel safe, importantly, if you don't trust your leadership and you don't feel heard, you won't feel included. We propose that a focus on empowerment at all levels is necessary, if not a sufficient remedy for harassment. So again, we heard some of this from our previous speaker. Lab and field environments are the focus of this session because they are, in some ways by nature, exclusive. They are privileged spaces with very narrow entry points. You usually have to be invited or qualify to visit, and each of us who has slipped through one of those narrow entry points, we know how lucky we are to be in a place like the Greenland ice sheet. And we also know how contingent that luck was on outside forces to get us there. We recognize that even as fieldwork elevates the excitement and stature of our science, it also elevates the challenges for inclusivity. For example, many tacit assumptions about who normally participates in fieldwork are literally built into field camps. The remoteness of fieldwork often goes along with a lack of facilities and infrastructure, which in turn can lead to a lack of privacy. Shared bath facilities, shared tents, I should say shared bath facilities if there are bath facilities. The first field camp I visited had no bathrooms. There wasn't a tree to be found for 300 miles. And so in those circumstances, the privacy you get is the privacy that you are given, hopefully by respectful colleagues. Fieldwork also requires specialized skills that serve as a particular barrier to those who didn't grow up cold starting snow machines, for example. I didn't grow up cold starting snow machines. Those are some of the built-in and visible barriers, but we know less visible barriers exist as well. Remoteness can lead to a sense that normal rules don't apply. One woman we spoke with mentioned this tired phrase that too many of us have heard: it doesn't count when you're 2,000 miles from home. It counts. Shared facilities, close quarters, long hours all serve to blur the life-work boundary that most of us are used to when we're sitting in offices, and the impact of seemingly innocuous comments can be amplified. Most of us have also heard the phrase, death by 1,000 paper cuts. So reflecting upon these issues, the thought arose, if we can teach statistics, we can teach our researchers how to avoid becoming a statistic in the field. 18 years ago, as a first-year graduate student, I wasn't aware of how high the risks were. I became one of those statistics at a field camp, and it became debilitating to my research aspirations. In fact, I left research for 6 years directly following the completion of my doctorate. I published nothing, and I avoided the scientific community as a result of those experiences. Thankfully, I have since found my way back in to a valuable role, but not everyone is so lucky. In their paper, Signaling Safety, Characterizing Fieldwork Experiences and Their Implications for Career Trajectories, Nelson et al. Mapped negative experiences in field settings into negative outcomes in career trajectories. These include stalling, lateral career moves, and career exits like my own. Evidence of such outcomes is both an injustice to individuals and it's a community-level loss of productivity and innovation. So what can be done? We focused on practices that increase empowerment because we believe it is a necessary, if not sufficient condition, or necessary, if not sufficient remedy for these challenges. So we're going to examine 4 actionable areas. These include inclusive practices for preparing for your field season and executing a field season through tasking and routines. Recommendations for inclusive leadership, which play a critical role in fostering positive work culture in and out of the field, and the role of networks to expand opportunities and resources for inclusion. So we've narrowed it down to the Arctic context, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So all due respect to Shackleton. From the standpoint of inclusivity, Arctic science has a lot of history to overcome. While the Arctic has always been inhabited by indigenous people of both genders, much of the modern Western science tradition that we associate with the Arctic, mapping the poles, magnetometry, cryospheric research, began during the colonial age, initiated mostly by state-sponsored male European explorers. So Carrie and all highlighted how many of these historical antecedents have played forward in the field of glaciology and led to high barriers for female participation. Similarly, many scholars have highlighted the ways that Arctic indigenous peoples have too often been the subject of research rather than included as partners in research, where they have much indigenous knowledge to contribute. So given that history, we believe the Arctic has much to offer as a case in this conversation. We also focused our recommendations on early career participants who are stepping into the field for the first time. And we emphasized in particular the risks posed by sexual harassment, misconduct, and discrimination. As Dr. McNutt mentioned, intersectionality reminds us that we should not conflate gender issues with racial issues or other forms of harassment. We do hope, however, that these recommendations provide a starting point for addressing the overlapping challenges of intersectional identities. So in addition to the literature, our recommendations were shaped through decades-long experience of running Arctic field programs. To supplement those, we elicited input from dozens of Arctic field researcher leaders and many identities through 2 focus questions shown here. And so I'm going to summarize the feedback we got from those questions in our recommendations. The first is probably the most and least obvious response. Choose your team with the goal of inclusion. Erin Pettit, the principal investigator for the Girls on Ice program, who incidentally also maintains a great resource of advice on a website for field programs, points out that we need to start by creating opportunities like her ice apprenticeship program for high school girls. Other respondents reinforced the view that hard skills or time spent in the field should not be a prerequisite for inclusion because field skills can be learned, which brings us to our next 2 recommendations. Proactively prepare expectations about field conditions well in advance. Many respondents shared their techniques for actively engaging around topics like hygiene or sharing photos of field conditions. Many of us have war stories from our first field season: the underrated sleeping bag, the boots that made your feet sweat, or the snack bar that becomes rock solid at 30 below. While the anecdotes can be funny after the fact, the lived experience of such things is very disempowering, and we want to avoid it where possible. Next, assure that everyone has skills-specific training prior to going into the field. In the Arctic, companies like Polar Field Services offer a host of trainings, such as those shown here. And I know that text is too small to read in this composite, but I'll say that nearly 1,000 participants with fairly balanced gender ratios have attended these trainings. Opportunities for hands-on training specific to the field, setting up tents, operating snow machines, staying warm, crevasse travel, they give everybody an opportunity to learn essential skills for success and feel ready to go. And explicit documentation leads to greater self-sufficiency, so there's no gatekeeper on your field team who has all of the knowledge. A second consideration that arose related to safety training programs is that harassment prevention stands to learn much from the decades of experience gained through implementing Arctic safety programs. These programs have already navigated the complex space of multi-layered institutions and employers sharing overlapping responsibilities. They've already thought through how to onboard new arrivals to sites regardless of their employer. And they've learned much culturally in terms of getting participant buy-in into these programs. Harassment prevention training, unconscious bias training, and bystander training include nuanced topics. They will be well served by dialogue-based processes that seek buy-in rather than instruction-oriented top-down practices. Which brings us to our next consideration. Field camps share some broad cultural outlines that can take time to catch up to if you've never experienced them. There are norms around autonomy and cooperation, norms around privacy and disruptiveness, norms around sharing. And there must be clearly stated codes of conduct. As several participants noted, it's important to get those norms and codes out there early, get buy-in and reinforce them often, and really get unconscious norms brought to the surface, I think, is an important point as well. As Carolina mentions here, be conscious of what you think the power dynamics might be. Have a game plan going in, be prepared. The next major theme that arose concerned executing inclusive tasking and routines in the field. We heard some version of this from nearly every respondent. Participants won't feel empowered if they don't share ownership in what's happening in the field, and it starts with their tasking. Create opportunities for individuals to be responsible for important tasks, set them up for success, that's very important, and be conscious that you aren't genderizing the tasks. Also on the note of implementing inclusive tasking, also repeated by nearly every respondent, was that ownership starts with input. Proactively give everyone a voice in planning and execution. As Zoe points out, sometimes that means seeking them out one by one. They might have things they don't want to share with the group. And it's especially important to give them a voice during the inevitable change of plans that goes along with fieldwork, which can be very disconcerting to first-timers. And important too, as Mary points out, is to de-emphasize hierarchies across the group where tasking is concerned. You can't de-emphasize hierarchies when you need to enforce policies, but where tasking is concerned, you can. At Summit Station, each visitor, no matter how famous or important, has to take their turn doing dishes and cleaning toilets. Renee, a major funder for Summit Station, on our title slide was shown shoveling off fuel bladders during one of her visits, and I can tell you that's everyone's least favorite job, but she pitched in, and that's important, and it's important to see your leaders do that. It really makes the camp feel so different. And so no discussion of inclusivity and empowerment would be complete without considering the role of leaders at all levels in fostering an inclusive climate. Again, stating the obvious, diverse leadership fosters a sense of inclusivity, and we need to promote diverse leadership. We also heard from many respondents that respect for the entire team must be a core value. This respect extends beyond identities and into the various roles people play in field settings. Whether you're a scientist or a member of the camp staff who's supporting the work, all work has dignity and it contributes to the efforts of the station. And then further, as I said at the beginning, in Arctic science, we frequently hear our colleagues, our scientific colleagues from indigenous organizations emphasize the need for respect as well. Respect for their homelands, where we conduct our work, and respect for their indigenous knowledge. An important point raised by our respondents and spelled carefully out in the signaling safety study is that there must be a responsiveness to and consequences for harassment and misconduct. Zero tolerance. And I think an important point is that they point out in the signaling safety study is that these issues don't always have the decency to be clear-cut. If something sounds ambiguous or if you don't understand it, be curious and check it out and ask follow-up questions until you're satisfied you understand what's going on. Toolik Field Station in Alaska, whose website is shown here, has implemented and enforced a code of conduct on all visitors to the station, regardless of who employs them. And a final point on leadership is you set the tone as the leader, and leadership happens at all levels. Those around you look to you for guidance. They will learn from your norms, strive to keep morale high, avoid and discourage gossip, and don't play favorites. So, you can't see Meredith's great quote that well, so I'll read it. I don't have a good model to follow. So many of you sitting in this room might be thinking, well, that's great if your leadership, institutes, and colleagues get it. We know often they don't. So when all else fails, reach out to people who do get it. Social media has enabled the growth of a diversity of professional networks. As Laura mentioned, my own work since I've returned to science has focused on the power of developing open and inclusive virtual networks for scientists. All networks expand our community from our immediate setting, what's known as your small world setting, to the bigger picture, enabling access to mentoring, knowledge, and collaborative opportunities. And there's some absolute experts on networks on this panel, including representatives from the Earth Science Women's Network, well represented here, but there's also a Women's Polar Science Network that I just learned about. Both provide spaces for important dialogues that cut across institutional boundaries and serve as platforms for non-traditional mentoring. IARPIC Collaborations, the site that Laura mentioned that I helped to create, is an Arctic science collaboration network that has drawn more than 1,300 members. It is an incredible resource for meeting new collaborators outside your research setting. There are others, but we are going to get short on time. So I'll say, moving forward, what does moving forward look like? So in the area of preparation that we discussed, we see emerging on the horizon a shift in the culture of field camps and the institutions that support them. I'm looking forward to hearing more from Erika momentarily about the new work that the Earth Science Women's Network will lead to improve preparatory training for fieldwork. Polar Field Services, where Kim works, has just formalized codes of conduct for its field staff, which will further empower all the researchers and contract staff they support. And Erin Pettit continues to lead women into the field, empowering next generation of cryospheric sciences, and other programs like hers are coming online. So from the standpoint of leadership, each one of us in this room has the opportunity to go home and press our leadership to adopt stronger policies. I'll highlight a few developments close to my own setting. My home institution of Ceres, which I'm not going to try to say the acronym for the reasons just demonstrated, has become a leading example for other institutes through creating a director-level position for diversity and inclusion. Susan Sullivan is here and happy to field questions about program developments. My own program, the U.S. Arctic Observing Network program, now officially has a line of effort dedicated to support inclusive practices for environmental observing. And this summer at the Polar 2018 meeting in Davos, we're organizing the first Polar Women's Luncheon to celebrate the achievements of women in polar science and to highlight the challenges, and hopefully to inspire a new generation of leadership. So with that, and given the red light, I will thank you.
A question for Sandy? Are there any? All right. If not, we will move into our panel discussion now. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith and Melissa for this. And we will start with all of them introducing themselves.
So we thought it might be helpful to our panel before we move into Q&A. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves, and some of them have slides to share with you, and they'll each introduce themselves just for a few minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. But we thought it might be useful to also get a sense of the audience for our panelists. So one of the things we thought we'd ask is, how many of you seen, Marcia McNutt mentioned the Me Too campaign, and so we were curious how many in our audience have seen a Me Too post or discussion in their network, right? So somebody that you know, right? So a majority. So that's really interesting. How many of you are participating in conversations about diversity and inclusivity at your workplace? Okay, a majority again. And is that happening peer-to-peer? You know, so I'm just having conversations with my peers. Are you having conversations with leaders at your institute? And are you having conversations with people who are senior to you? Okay. So that's interesting, right? So all of us are having those conversations. All of us have connections to wanting to increase diversity and inclusion, but we're also having conversations and know people who have been harassed. And so I think that's really important and interesting to recognize. So to begin with, Melissa's going to introduce each of our panelists, and they'll speak for a few minutes, like I said, and then we'll open it up to an open conversation with everyone.
Great, thank you, Meredith. So our first panelist who's going to say a couple words is Dr. LaToya Myles, who was recently promoted to Deputy Director of the Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division in the NOAA Air Resources Laboratory. I'm not going to go through all of this because I think you can speak about yourself better than I probably can, but she's had a long history in thinking about broadening participation in her previous appointments. She earned her PhD through the NOAA Environmental Cooperative Science Center at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, and she's conducted research in collaboration with the Air Resources Laboratory for an interdisciplinary dissertation focusing on atmospheric deposition of pollutants and their impact on ecosystems. You can either.
Thank you for the introduction. I only have 2 slides. My first is a title slide here, and when I was invited to be part of this panel, I immediately thought about some of the phrases and the words that we use when we talk about how we recruit individuals and bring them into the geosciences, whatever the subdiscipline. And one of the phrases I always hear is the best and the brightest. So I decided to use that as kind of tongue-in-cheek for my presentation title, because I think a lot of times we talk about the best and the brightest, and we're only speaking about folks who are the best and the brightest in our individual spheres of influence, and we aren't really thinking about who may be best and brightest overall. So one of my challenges today to everyone in the audience is to think about how you can broaden your own individual network. And in thinking about that, I said we have to really do this 2 phases. We have to address composition, and we also have to address culture. We have to address who's in the room, in the field, in the lab, on the ship, on the plane. We also have to address the culture that that person is exposed to during their time as a scientist, whether that's as a graduate student all the way up to a senior scientist. And if we're only looking for the best and the brightest, then we need to look for the best and the brightest regardless of gender identification, regardless of race, background, socioeconomic activities. All of those things should not matter if we are truly looking for that individual spark of someone who is a scientist. We also have to think about retention and promotion. What happens is sometimes we bring individuals in and then we fail actually to maintain them in the field. There are many reasons for that, but how do we continue to retain and promote individuals so that they feel valued members of the team, and then they have an opportunity to become more senior in their field and actually be part of discussions and decision making. And then finally it comes to leadership and legacy. We have leaders in the field who we know who have had some egregious activities that they've been engaged in, as the previous 2 speakers addressed, but then who are we keeping and retaining in the field so they actually get to be leaders? Who are we promoting? Who are we nominating for awards? Who are those folks who we're putting up as some of the best and brightest, who are retaining and promoting so that they get an opportunity to be leaders in the geosciences? So my one recommendation I ask you to take away from my remarks today is to think about membership matters. I think almost everyone in this room is a member of AGU. Many of you may be members of things like the Earth Science Women's Network. So my challenge to you is join an organization with which you personally do not identify. For example, how many of you are actually members of SOCNUS? A few. How many know what SOCNUS is? All right, so we have the knowledge, but why haven't you joined? How many of you are members of the National Association of Mathematicians? How many are members of the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers? National Organization of Black Geoscientists? National Organization of Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers? So if we're really looking to change and make our geosciences disciplines more diverse, think about it. How can you do that if you don't network with people who are different than you? Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Anita Marie Marshall, who is a PhD student at the University of South Florida in the Department of Geology with a focus on geoscience education.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. My first panel appearance, so. Yay. All right, so I am here representing both the University of South Florida, and also I work as an executive counselor for the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. We work specifically to expand access to the geosciences for students with disabilities. This is an interesting group because people with disabilities are often excluded even from the conversation about diversity itself. It is the invisible group in many of these conversations, and so I'm very happy to be here to raise the awareness. The geosciences do the worst of any track STEM field on including people with disabilities. It's estimated that about 1% of people that graduate with a geoscience degree have a disability. That's not okay. There are lots of things I could talk about with this. My particular focus is on identifying and addressing barriers to participation, specifically in fieldwork, trying to make fieldwork more accessible for a broader range of people. This may not sound like, we're talking about very many people, but somewhere about 23% of the American population identifies as having a disability. Currently, those people are not very welcome in the geosciences, and that's something that really needs to change. So the project I'm currently working on is part of a NSF-funded GeoPath project where we're looking at developing and testing ways to include everybody in field work. We do this primarily technology-based, but there are lots of, low-tech ways to do this. A lot of it has to do with your attitude. There are lots of barriers to participation in the geosciences. Of course, we can think of many, if you think about field work and how that's obviously going to present challenges. A lot of it has to do with our mentality, though. One of the biggest barriers that we face is not a physical or environmental barrier at all. It's the social and cultural barrier of the geosciences, where a heavy emphasis is placed on a student's physical ability rather than their mental ability. You think about how many times you took a field trip and you hiked hours and hours through this incredible terrain, which was great, and then you had this awesome lecture at the top of the mountain. Well, what about the people that couldn't make it up there? Like, they missed all of that, right? So there are some things to consider. Your locations. Why did you choose that location? Why are you going there? I've been on field trips where I'm not sure what the point of that 3-hour hike was, right? Other than that we did it. So there may be better options. Just consider why you're going up there. Is there a road cut that has equally good example of what you're trying to show your students? There might be. If you have students in your class that have a disability, maybe consider going to that location instead. Be flexible with your format. If students have, say, motor skill disabilities, allow them to take digital notes. Don't be so hung up on pen and paper or field notebooks that you're not open to, say, them using iPads. Right? There are lots of ways to work around it if you are willing to be flexible in the approach and in the deliverables that you're asking your students to produce. And then the third one, the social climate, is critical. It is the biggest barrier. It runs more people with disabilities out of the geosciences than anything else. I could tell many personal and stories from my friends of ways that this is true. So I'm very happy to be on the panel. You can ask me questions about my research on including students with disabilities, or I am personally a geoscientist who is from this community, so feel free to ask me questions in either one of those capacities. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. So our next panelist, stalled just a little bit, is Billy M. Williams, who serves as the Vice President of Ethics, Diversity, and Inclusion at AGU, and he's going to say a few words about some of his experiences with AGU.
All right, thank you, Melissa, and it's a pleasure to be here today to share with you some of the work underway at AGU that we think can help influence the culture that exists. And some of this has been mentioned already, but my focus here today is to talk primarily about what we see as a strong role that professional societies can play in helping to change the culture across our geosciences. And there's been a lot of discussion across AGU over the past 2 years on what is our role and what should we be doing and what should other societies be doing. These have not been isolated discussions. We have these discussions with other societies as well. And we see our roles as being a role to help educate, to help put into code, to help enforce, to help provide education and training, to help empower people in our geosciences, and also to help provide additional research on these topics. So we see a strong and somewhat unique role that professional societies can play in helping to influence our culture. Over the past 2 years, AGU has been very heavily involved in two areas. One is in providing workshops and seminars and webinars at all of our conferences and invited to other conferences as well. But the primary area that's been referenced here today is the updates to the AGU ethics policy. So I'll just walk through that very quickly with you, let you know what those key changes were in case you're not aware. So here are the key changes. It expands the definition of scientific misconduct to include misconduct towards others, so it explicitly calls out harassment in science as scientific misconduct. It includes code of conduct implications for honors and recognitions and for AGU governance participants. That is to say, in the past, for AGU awardees, when you're considering is this person worthy of an AGU award, that discussion has been focused primarily on their specific scientific research achievements. And we are expanding that discussion to include the broader definition of that person's fitness to receive these awards for AGU. Our policy changes will also include cover misconduct that might harm another AGU member or might bring harm to AGU's mission or reputation. To help make this happen, we will use sanctioned self-disclosure to help us really implement this and make sure it's effective, but there are no statutes of limitations in our updated policy. We will also make our ethics actions more broadly known. In the past, we've made our ethics summary report only to the AGU Board of Directors, and going forward, we will make known a summary of the number of issues we've had and how they've been resolved, without disclosing any names, of course. But the bottom line in all of this is our updates to our ethics policy and our ethics program overall. The focus here is not to be an ethics police. Our goal here is to help educate and inform. So there are other actions in progress, such as the Safe AGU program. You'll see people here at this meeting wearing Safe AGU buttons. This has nothing to do with field camp experiences, but it does talk about setting the tone for what you expect in any environment that you're responsible for. We are sponsoring bystander intervention workshops. We do have a sexual harassment, stop harassment website that we would refer you to. We also in the process of establishing partnerships with other organizations to have additional resources brought to the attention of our membership or to the full Earth and Space science community. So one recommendation I would have is for each of you, if you're not already aware, to be aware of some of these resources available through AGU. One of these key resources is the Stop Harassment website. There you will find examples of codes of conduct. You will find examples of if you're in an organization that really doesn't know where to start in terms of putting codes of conduct in place, you'll find some good resources at this spot. So again, thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions on this later. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Max Holmes, who is an Earth System Scientist at Woods Hole Research Center, who studies rivers and their watersheds and how climate change and other disturbances are impacting the cycles of water and chemicals in the environment. Dr. Holmes recently served for 2 years as the Program Director of the National Science Foundation's Arctic System Science Program, and in 2015 was named National Fellow of the Explorers Club. You're going to speak for him.
Thanks for that introduction, and I don't have any slides, so I think I'll just sit here. I'll start by saying I'm really humbled to be part of this conversation, to be on this panel, and to be in this discussion. And the brief comments I'll offer right now are largely informed by the involvement I've had over the past several years in a project we call the Polaris Project, which each year takes around 20 people, more or less, to the Arctic to engage in field work. And there's a real focus on undergraduate students, so it's 10 or 12 undergraduates, 2 or 3 graduate students, which are typically alumni, so they started in previous years as undergrads, maybe a postdoc, and then faculty or PIs involved in the project. We initially, for several years, the core of the program, this field experience, was in the Russian Arctic. Now it's in the Yukon River Delta in Alaska, in a very remote camp, 50 miles by float plane from a town. We strive for diversity in the makeup of the group, whether it's gender or racial or socioeconomic or geographic or orientation or everything else. So we try to get this very broadly diverse group involved in the project. And again, the real focus is on the student participants, and the PIs are basically, the students are all sort of designing and implementing their own programs, and the PIs are there to assist and mentor. We don't have our own individual research agenda. The goal is to really create the next generation and to communicate what we're doing to broader audiences. I think my more specific comments are largely going to echo some things you already heard, particularly by Sandy Starkweather, but I'm going to focus on some of the things we do in preparation for this field experiment experience, so what happens beforehand, and then some of what happens after the fact as well. And, you know, sort of training and risk management, I think, are key. So the applications for participation are due January 15th. We generally select our group by early February, and then soon thereafter we start having webinars, basically monthly webinars where sort of the group dynamics get set, where we all get some common basis of knowledge. And then that leads to, it's generally in April or May, we have a field safety training weekend that's actually put on by Polar Field Services. So all the participants come to Woods Hole, and that's the new ones, the ones who, the faculty or PIs who have done it many times. We're all there in Woods Hole, nominally to talk about polar field safety, and that's really important, but we also all get to know each other. And that's also critically important, I think, to start to set the norms of behavior for the group and those sorts of expectations. All the participants have some medical pre-screening beforehand. That's critical. In one of the years, several years ago, we had a serious medical issue in the Siberian Arctic that took us a while to recognize it was a serious medical issue, but it culminated in a medical evacuation flight coming from Alaska. And everything turned out all right, but that made us think really hard, even, you know, a lot more about safety issues. And I just didn't want to be in that situation again, and through a series of fortunate circumstances, I think I got connected with a guy who's the director of the Wilderness Medicine Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's an emergency medicine physician, and either he or some fellow in the program he directs has gone with us to the field each year. They're the ones who conduct the medical pre-screening, so we don't have to try to figure out the conditions beforehand, but then we also have these wonderful physicians with us in the field. And an important thing I'd say in the context of this conversation, beyond the obvious risk mitigation, is that in the field, everyone meets with a physician multiple times to talk about any medical issues, but I've also found that everyone's used to talking to physicians about all kinds of personal and private issues, and I think in the context of issues like sexual harassment or emotional issues or whatever, it's wonderful to have that person there, and very comforting for all of us, I think. Other things we do in the field, I'd say we have morning and evening meetings, breakfast and dinner, which I think are really critical to talk about the plans for the day, to talk about safety issues that are on people's minds, for people to express concerns and so on, and as well as just to share plans for the day, what went well, what didn't go well. Just a bit about networks, and I'll keep it focused really on this Polaris project, this individual project. But again, it's 20 people per year. I think we have 9 students who participated this summer in the Polaris project that are presenting at AGU here this week. It's their first presentations at meetings like this. They're not in education sections, they're in Arctic sessions, so I'll encourage you to look for those. A lot of those posters are on Thursday, but beyond that, there's a lot of alumni from this program that are here. So sort of once you're in this, you're part of this larger network, and you have peers and mentors at all different levels, and you start to see them move up the chain. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation that follows.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so our final panelist is Dr. Erika Marin-Spiotta, who is an associate professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she is the lead PI of a new advanced partnership award to develop bystander intervention and ethics training to address sexual harassment in the geosciences. Dr. Marin-Spiotta is committed to increasing the participation of historically underrepresented groups in science, and she currently serves on the leadership board for the Earth Science Women's Network.
Great, thank you. So today I want to talk about this new project. It's recently funded by the Advanced Program of the National Science Foundation, and it is specifically to address hostile work climates in the geosciences. We've already heard some data about instances of harassments in different fields, and just to give you a little bit more background, as Melissa mentioned, I'm on the board of the Earth Science Women's Network, and we had an informal survey of our membership a few years ago, and 51% of 500 respondents to the survey said that they had experienced sexual harassment sometime in their career. So that's more than 1 in every 2. So this is definitely a challenge. So we're very excited about this new project. It's in partnership with the American Geophysical Union. They're an official co-PI on the proposal, or on the grant, and the Association for Women Geoscientists and the Earth Science Women's Network. And our primary goal is to develop and test sexual harassment bystander intervention training with geoscience relevant scenarios. So it'll be different from some of the required training you might have to take at your institution. We really want to make this relevant to the community. And we're actually including, the focus is sexual harassment, but we're really focusing on hostile. We really want to think about what makes hostile climates. And so that includes bullying, that includes gender harassment, that includes racial harassment as well. And in addition to having geoscience relevant scenarios, we really are incorporating a focus of a lens of intersectionality. And the idea is that different communities are more vulnerable to different types of harassment. So for example, some data from some recent surveys that have came out in the astronomy and planetary sciences community revealed that 27% of white women reported feeling unsafe in their current position due to gender, but 40% of women of color reported feeling unsafe. So, there are different groups that are experiencing harassment and hostile climates in different ways, and we need to be inclusive of those experiences, and any policies, any training that we develop really has to include a lens of intersectionality. For example, a recent survey in the physics community revealed that 36% of LGBT plus responders considered leaving their workplace or school because of unsafe environments. So this is really, this hostile climate affects a really broad community. So in addition to harassment bystander intervention training, which will actually, in partnership with AGU and the National Association Geoscience Teachers, you will be able to participate in that at the conferences, and we will also be training a traveling team of trainers that can come to your institution. You will also be able to participate in webinars and download materials where you can hold your own trainings at your institution. We're developing teaching modules that include harassment in the conversation of research misconduct, and this is really following the cue of AGU, changing their code of ethics. So if you teach anything about research ethics, you need to include conversations about inclusivity and diversity and practices that are counteractive to that. And so it's a partnership advanced program. It's not based at one institution. We actually have 5 institutions involved, but in partnership with professional societies to bring it to the broader community and sustain and disseminate these materials. And ideally, even though we're focusing on the geosciences because that's where we had really strong networks, and it's one of the least diverse fields in STEM, the idea is that the model could be transferred to other disciplines. And so, we have the Science Education Research Center at Carleton College as a partner, the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. We're also collaborating with the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, SACNAS, and the National Association of Black Geoscientists, as well as other organizations. So if you're interested, please contact us. And also I'll put in a plug, if you want to participate in some of the research that will help us develop this training, we're having 4 focus groups here at the meeting, and you have the information on the slide. Thank you.
All right, so we want to open up the conversation to you guys. We have some pre-prepared questions if you guys are shy, but I really would like to open it up to you to have a chance to ask the questions that you're really interested in and hopefully getting some practical ideas and practical advice on creating more diverse and inclusive environments. So I'm going to just start over here and then come back to you, okay? Please. So let me just repeat the question real quick. Can you mention your employer again? Lawrence Livermore National Lab. So those of you looking for jobs, keep an eye out for LLNL. Okay, but to our panel, and maybe we can start with LaToya, since you mentioned, increasing your diversifying your network, right, to increase the diversity of the applications that you might receive. And so are there practical tips that you all can give to our audience on how to increase the diversity of applications they're receiving for various positions?
Sure. I think it's really great that your organization is bringing in these students. And so I'm wondering if there are people who are maybe not affiliated with actually bringing in the students that are from diverse backgrounds, whether African American, Latino, Latina, that are working at the lab, who are part of the group that are having discussions about where you're recruiting. Your face says no. I agree. I think sometimes having someone who, for example, like the folks on this committee and their organizations, whether it's within your own organization or you can go out and maybe partner with some, to have somebody in the room when you're having those initial discussions about recruiting. Yeah, I think broadening that conversation. I also think of having a target of reaching out to universities that are minority serving universities and institutions is good. And not just saying that on paper of you're sending an email to someone, which is typically what happens, but actually making connections with those who are PIs and department chairs and having that one-on-one conversation with them that others are having with their own home institutions is a good strategy too.
So I think Billy and Marcia both wanted
Yes,
to.
I don't have an answer to your question that can add to what LaToya gave you, but I will say there's a diversity and inclusion panel, town hall meeting at this meeting on Thursday this week, and there's some panelists there who have some expertise in this. So if you're around on Thursday at 6:15, in room 203 to 205. There are some people there, I think, who have some specific expertise and that might be able to give you some additional advice. Thank you.
So my advice is this has to start from the top down with the leader of the lab putting it in the performance evaluations of every direct report that puts targets in for diversifying the workforce such that there are attainable goals in hiring, and you leave it to them to decide how they're going to find these people, where they're going to recruit, how they're going to develop the talent pipeline. But it has to be in their performance goals that they are going to develop in the group below them a more diverse workforce. And unless it's in their performance requirements, it doesn't happen. You can develop all the panels you want.
I'll also put another plug, or a plug for another event that's happening here at AGU through the education program on Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 4. There's an entire workshop on this exact conversation of how to recruit a more diverse workforce and student body in the geosciences.
Did you have a question related to this topic?
I'm Bill Mankey from Montgomery. Just a thought concerning that last question. I think Marcia is right on from the top. Having a policy that requires some kind of search committee, even in cases like postdoctoral hires, I think is important because of the search committee, you can have policies that foster diversity. But my question is concerns field trips and policies that relate to smaller field trips, let's contrast it with the big Arctic field camps. Should we be moving towards establishing some minimum for the number of people on field trips as a best practice, say 3 or more? Because my understanding from scholarship is that a lot of the rapping happens on one-on-one kind of field trip, field experience.
And to clarify, when you say, you mean field work, so like field research versus like a field trip where you might take students on a...
I guess, to put it simply, should we as a university adopt a policy that we don't have 1 or 2 person
field trips?
One person.
Maybe I'll start with Anita and then Sandy, if you guys want to comment on that. So he was asking about whether he as a leader at his institution, whether they should be enforcing a certain number minimum for field work. So for example, should you have like a minimum of 3 people and basically not support field work that would only take place with 1 or 2 individuals? Well, 1 I guess wouldn't make sense, but 2 individuals or more. You can't harass yourself, I think. So Sandy, do you want to talk a bit about that?
So, I think I'm live here. I think that Kim could probably give some insight into this. I'll give her a second to think about it. But I think we need to adopt much more risk management around all these practices. And so regardless of the size of the group or the nature of the group, I think having risk management conversations in front of any field activity And maybe it's not just risk management, but some level of conversation about accessibility and inclusivity is really important. And I would venture to guess that most institutions want to get ahead from a safety standpoint anyway. I mean, there's just basic safety things you should be thinking about when you go into the field. Make that aspect of your risk management conversation part of it. Just broaden your view of risk, and that might be a good starting point. Do you want to add anything to that?
So having some models or that, you know, documentation that your institution can share with anyone going into the field that at least has some, you know, again, I think one of the things that was presented in the slides too was, you know, having, if you start with some sort of training or some sort of material that everyone at your institution is aware of and has to see or read before they go in the field, you at least have a common place where everyone's starting and expectations for how they should be able to, you know, what they should be able to access in the field, how safe they should be able to feel, you know, what they have access to and who to contact if they don't feel safe or don't feel prepared. So I think that that's a really, so, you know, Max had mentioned a few resources that they've created for the Arctic specifically, but maybe using those as a model for your own type of field work. Annette, did you want to?
It's a great comment. I will pass it along to the appropriate people.
She mentioned
right.
that.
Absolutely. I think, again, as we look at diversity and inclusion across AGU, we need to just be more constant across all of our programs rather than just thinking about in the talent pool or wherever. Great comment. Thank you.
I think there was a question back here. So is our gender-based focus limiting our ability to create diversity, especially in our leadership, especially in considering ethnic and racial diversity? And are we, you know, how do we decrease our limitations in that?
I just have a comment on that. We did a recent study at the National Academy of Sciences and were frankly appalled by our record in women with racial diversity. We're actually doing not badly in men with racial diversity, and we're doing quite well in women, Caucasian women. But for women with racial diversity, we're talking about almost single digits for Black women, Hispanic women, American Indian women. And we're about to launch a study to try to find out why it is that we can find highly qualified men to elect to the academy and highly qualified Caucasian women, but not racially diverse women to elect to the academy. And our concern is that these women are facing a double hurdle because they're both racially diverse and they're women, and that the hurdle they face trying to get to the level of career attainment to get into the academy is almost overwhelming. And we know so many of them who have taken a sidetrack in their career into academic management. They become deans, they become provosts, they go into various high levels of academic diversity offices and things like that, in which they're doing great jobs, but they don't get the academic portfolio that would get them elected to the academy. And that's what our concern is.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, of course.
Just briefly. Corey, congratulations again on your selection to SOCNA's board. I think one of the issues, it is a double indemnity almost, as African American and female, particularly in the geosciences. And I think one of the things that tends to get overlooked as it goes back to my slide about, are we promoting and retaining? You know, it's really sad when I look across my discipline and I can name most of the African American female scientists who are doing work like this. I don't even have to go to toes. I can only do it on fingers. But there are so many of us who are really struggling with being promoted and recognized in the field, because a lot of times we aren't given the high profile projects. A lot of times we are caught up in doing a lot of the grunt work in the field and in the lab, so you really don't have an opportunity or the recognition for doing a lot of the high level projects which allow you to get the scholarship level to be elected as a fellow. And so that's one of those issues that we have to work through, because I know that I've even been encouraged walking around the floor this morning here is I've seen more African American females at this particular meeting than I have in most of my time that I've been attending AGU. And I just noticed that as I was walking around, just anecdotally, well, okay, if we're bringing folks in, then how are we retaining them and allowing them to reach a top level of scholarship so that they can be recognized?
I thought I'd circle back to you, Marcia. I was curious, in the review of the National Academy scientists, was there also any sense of data on how many have disabilities? Is that ever represented in any of the data you collect?
Okay. True confession here. The National Academy members, the average age is verging on 80. So if you look at disabilities, sure, you know, I mean, if we didn't have wheelchair ramps and ability to accommodate walkers, we wouldn't be able to hold our meetings. So this is a difficult question to answer.
Well, this also, it brings up a kind of a frustrating thing that I've run up into just doing the research for my PhD, is that that demographic is often not tracked in a lot of, you know, AGI or any place where you look for, you know, demographic information on the geosciences. Some of them used to track it, they don't anymore. They do very odd and unusual groupings with how they, so, you know, if you're talking about physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, right, like it's all lumped into one giant thing, and it's incredibly hard to get hard numbers on that particular thing. So yeah.
I'll come back to the audience here. So.
Broaden the conversation. Yeah. Right.
So I have a really practical question about incorporating students with disabilities, and that has to do with the behavior of the undergrad demographic. So a lot of the
So a practical question about leading field trips for undergraduates, and how do you create a conversation around the types of limitations that might exist that are important and might create unsafe environments for these students?
Right. So there are, the first thing that has to be addressed is that students are not required to tell you anything about their medical conditions. There are laws that protect that. This makes this conversation even harder. And it starts with creating a culture in your department and in your class where they feel comfortable disclosing to you, because they don't have to. And if they feel like they will be ostracized or there will be negative impacts for talking to their professors about these concerns, they're not going to do it. And then you're going to create a situation where you're going to get out in the field and people will be put in very unnecessarily dangerous positions. They do and students will choose to put themselves in that dangerous situation. I personally have put myself in very dangerous situations trying to hide the fact that I had a physical disability. And in hindsight, and it's because you don't feel like culturally it's okay, like to talk to your professor. So you need to be very open with your students that, they can come and talk to you about it. It's okay. It's not gonna impact any part of how you grade them or anything like that. But the other thing, information is a big barrier. You put a lot of time and effort into planning field trips, but your students don't really see a lot of that. Students with disabilities need information to be able to decide whether they can safely participate in a field trip, or even if they can do the assignment that you'll be expecting them to do. So they need to know just the basics of what's the terrain like, where are we staying, how far is the nearest hospital, like things like that are going to make them decide whether or not it's cool to participate. There are studies that show that students with disabilities will self-select out of field trips, either from informational barriers, they can't get the information they need to make a reasonable decision, or cultural barriers, they feel like they will bring down the fieldwork experience for others just by their presence. And so that's the kind of cultural things that need to be addressed ahead of time before you get in the field, because the professors set the example for the students, right? Like you're the one that's showing them how to be around people. And so it's something that has to start way ahead of before you set foot in the field. So
I'll mention too, a practical piece of advice on this I had received was to create a field guide for your field trips. And you can include a lot of this material in there, anything you've ever experienced, right? So a super easy one is for women, like what are the bathroom facilities going to be like? Erin Pettit has a fantastic blog post about, what to do about getting your period when you're in the Arctic or Antarctic. So these are things you can list on a, website in your field guide, and you can have, not everybody has to read everything, right? They could click on a question, but, what do I do if I have diabetes? What do I do if I, don't have any hiking boots? What do I do if, and just as you, in your experience, as you're teaching those classes and the things that you encounter each year, revise that and add to those list of questions that, you encounter. But then it's on a web-based material that you can keep updating and the students can access, and they don't have to feel like they have to raise their hand in class and say, what if I have this, what if I can't change in front of people, that kind of thing, right? You want to just give them the opportunity to have access to that information. So you had a question over here?
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Okay, you and then you.
Another comment I have is just, I think like the attitudes towards Black female scientists have to change. When I walk around a poster session, I don't like being looked at as if I don't belong there or that I'm not being taken seriously. Those attitudes have to change. I can't be asked every time, like if I work here at the convention center. Yes, I'm here working at the convention center because I am a scientist. So these prevailing like or stereotypical views of Black women and women of color just have to change. And that means that the attitudes toward us in academia has to change. So I think moving forward, AGU needs to add, like just like you say, out of the field and everywhere else, put respect on our names, put respect on who we are, because if we do that, then more of us will show up, more of us will be promoted, more of us will be recognized. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to run because I really want to go to Dan Rather's.
All right, thank you for your comments. Okay, back to this young woman in the front.
Well, first of all, I'm really excited about this conversation is being held here at ATU, and I feel like there's a lot of ambition in like upper echelons of university administrations to make diversity a priority, but it also seems that the power to actually implement that and be effective at that is being held much lower down in the structure. So with department chairs and individual faculty members, and so I'm at the University of Washington, and one example of this is that the biology department recently did this whole letter on diversity from the grad students, and it was really well received by the faculty, and they have a committee on it. Meanwhile, in the physics department, the incoming class had 31 students, one of whom was a woman, and the grad students wrote a letter about it, and the faculty threatened to fire them. So a lot of power is like, you know, like an individual with individual. So what are sort of the pressure points to change that, like the pressure that's prevailing over the top?
Yeah, so there's unequal cultures, right, even at the same university. And so what are the pressure points that you can affect change at your institution? Panelists, do you have any input on that? I mean, I'd be interested, Billy, have you heard very much feedback on the change, the code of ethics changes that AGU has made and how that might be influencing code of ethics at universities who have large geoscience populations?
So we have received positive feedback. We've received positive feedback from people at universities wanting to know how they can adapt some things that we have in place to their local settings. I would say for folks like in the physics departments, they should look towards the professional society as well to see if they can help establish a different set of expectations, because I have interfaced with AIP, and I know the people there have the same desire that we have at AGU. So I think there's a way that you can help promote change through professional societies, because they can do things that the universities cannot do. We can do it more easily, I would say that.
And it's more cross-cutting, I guess.
I would just add that by standing up at AGU and asking that question, you're shining a light on the problem, and that can be part of this solution, actually. It can put the pressure on, and if enough people stand up and point out the problem, I think maybe the solution follows.
Yeah.
And maybe it's raising the awareness of the upper administration at a large school like University of Washington, right? You know, the biology department really responded, the physics department really didn't, but if the upper administration says, hey, departments, you all need to be taking blah, blah, blah into account, right, then you know, Marcia talked about, you know, this top-down approach of making sure that the materials that are out there and the pressure out there is on everybody. You want to follow up? Mm-hmm.
My question is that at the University of Washington, our grad students are grad student union, and we're currently working on unionizing the postdocs, and I see that too as a way to build power amongst the lower ranks.
So unionization as a mechanism for change. Marcia, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make kind of a general comment about this. The National Academy just finished a report on the opioid epidemic, and I think that this issue of harassment and lack of inclusion in the sciences is has a lot of parallels to the recommendations we had for the opioid epidemic, because it is an epidemic that's almost like a disease or a cancer in our community that needs to be eradicated. And what we recommended for the opioid epidemic was like a three-pronged stool. One was the triage, stop the deaths. The other was stop the incentives for the bad behavior, or in terms of the prescribers and the drug companies that are fueling the epidemic. And third, deal with the environment and the situation that leads to these deaths of despair. And I think the parallels in our situation here is, first of all, we have to do the triage to deal with the victims and help them find some recourse. Secondly, we have to stop the incentive structure that is allowing the bad actors to be shielded by their institutions, to hide behind non-disclosures, for the institutions to have attorney-client privilege that doesn't give us any transparency into who those bad actors are. And then third, we have to create this inclusive environment that allows everyone to feel valued, to feel like they are part of the team, and so that the roots of this are just choked off. And I think if we look at this as to what every player in it can do on all three prongs of that stool, then we'll make progress.
Please.
I was asked to give a presentation at Ole Miss on diversity and globalization in higher education. And I thought, well, easy. You know, I know about discrimination with respect to African Americans, and I figured that would be my focus. And they said, we want you to also deal with gender issues as well. And in the research, I admit, it really shocked me to see how far back that discrimination against women existed. The first university established, still in existence on this earth, El Camerino University in Fez, Morocco, founded by a woman, Fatima El Fili, in the 1st century, in the 800s. And it wasn't until the 20th century that women were allowed to attend the university. And the University of Paris, one of the oldest universities in Europe. It wasn't until the 19th century that they admitted their first female professor and as a member of the faculty. But they waited until this woman had already received the Nobel Prize. Madame Curie. Okay, and that was only after her husband died. So it's, I think it's clear that a collectivity of groups that experience harassment, discrimination, etc., form a common front in dealing with these crises, because we have common enemies.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. We have a hand back here. So how do we reach out to our K through 12 students to encourage them to even start at that point pursuing and thinking about pursuing careers in the geosciences?
AGU does not have any specific resources directed towards K through 12 currently. AGI does, however, so I would like to make sure you put you in contact with the people at American Geosciences Institute, because they do have resources to help support that. AGU is planning to have a hands-on museum in its updated facilities by the end of next year. So that might also be a resource for you to go forward. And personally, I'd be willing to help collaborate with you and support whatever you're trying to do in the DC area. Thank you.
Yes, so topic near and dear to my heart. I sit on the advisory board for SEM Link, which is an organization based out of Atlanta, but we do work in the DC area, and so I encourage you to reach out to this semsuccess.org. And so look for other organizations in particular that may already be engaged in doing some work in K through 12 and K through 16 level of advancing STEM, not particularly just geosciences, but all STEM fields, with kids through science fairs and projects and going into schools and bringing individuals who are scientists into the classroom to interact with students. You know, one of my most, I guess, memorable experiences was when AGU was in San Francisco and I visited a school in Oakland and talked to a student, and she said, you know, I really love animals. I want to be a zoologist, but I've never seen anybody do that who looks like me. And I was the first person of color that she'd seen that was a scientist. She had this Albert Einstein mentality of what a scientist should look like. But that was through this organization, SEM Link, that connected me with that school. So you really have to start thinking about someone who already may be working in that space and collaborating together and forming that united front, like you said, in order to address that. One of the things I also want to recommend are books. The panel asked us about this. What books or podcasts or things could we recommend? One of my daughter's favorites is Ada Twist Scientist. If you've ever seen it, she's a little girl that has Afro puffs, and she's a scientist and is curious and asks questions and has a supportive family structure in which to do that. And the other is Rosie Revere Engineer. And these books help young girls see themselves in these roles, and I think that's one way for us to get started.
Awesome. Other question? Comment? So the National Academy studies on diversity or just on women? Underrepresented. Underrepresented groups.
Yeah, right. So we are just undertaking the study now, and we're trying to find out what the difference is between underrepresented men, the pool of underrepresented men versus the pool of underrepresented women in the sciences. Whether they have gone in different career tracks, and whether that explains the difference in their representation in the academy. If it does, I can certainly understand the thought process. You can imagine a woman who's mid-career and she's bright, talented, working hard in her lab, doing well, but like all of you, writing 10 proposals a year in order to get 2 funded. And someone from her university comes to her and says, we would love you to become an associate dean. And if she takes on that job, she's got regular working hours. It's a 9-to-5 job, which means that she's going to be there to pick up her kids from school every night. She's on a career path that takes her right up the university administration. She has an opportunity to be in a position to bolster the number of underrepresented minorities in the university because of her, her role in the administration. And so she views this as a win for her personally and as a chance to promote diversity goals for the university. So gosh, this seems like a no-brainer. But what it does mean is another 15 years down the road, if she does this at, say, age 30 or 35, when she's 50, she doesn't have that stream of uninterrupted publications that's going to get her elected to the academy.
So I'd like to respond to that.
Oh, endowed chairs. Right. And we would probably see that also in the endowed chairs for the same reason. But that would be something we could look at.
I think one of the challenges that we need to address as well is that there is a very strong gender and racial bias in the way that we evaluate people and their contributions to the science and the scientific community, and understand that the evaluation process that most of our institutions participate in were developed for white men by white men, and it's not a structure that really, I mean, I got tenure despite all the work I've been doing to improve my community to make it more inclusive, right? And I say despite, not because of it. But I think we really need to think about how do we change our institutional structures and barriers to better serve the entire community, right? We shouldn't be asking people who are interested in social justice issues to put that aside for 30 years so they can build their publication record. I mean, that is a loss to the scientific community. So I would really challenge us to think about, granted, there are some structures that we need to work in right now, and how do we change our culture, but really the big question is how do we change those structures and those barriers?
Any other? So how about as our final question, we'll wrap up here, maybe the panelists, as many of you can think of, kind of what resources, what are best practices or resources where you can find best practices for increasing diversity and inclusivity. I mean, a lot of those were shared via your presentations, but if you have specific ideas.
You could come to our workshop on Wednesday afternoon, where we will be sitting down at tables to actually with people who can share their experiences with what's worked, and the whole idea is to walk out of there with a list of things that you could try at your own institution.
Yeah, and I know one resource I've been in touch with, SERC, SERC, the circcarleton.edu site. They have a best practices for designing job ads for faculty searches, and ways in language to include and ways to scope your language to get broader applicant pools. Do other people have ideas or websites or books or podcasts that can share?
One effort that NSF has been engaged in quite recently is the Geoscience Opportunities for Leadership and Diversity. It's the GOLD program, and there are several folks, Corey was one of them, who are engaged as I am in some of that work, and we're actually doing different sessions. I'm part of the Hearts of Gold program, where we're looking for geoscience leaders, those folks who are senior scientists, who are at the dean level, who are at the endowed chair level, the higher levels, and we're having workshops with them to talk about diversity and inclusion and what they can do to help advance this as a united front within the geosciences. And there's several other programs out there that are part of this GOLD effort from NSF. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to Google it, and there's a great website up that's being supported by UCAR now to talk about those various projects.
And one other strategy that hasn't been mentioned so far today that I've seen work exceptionally well, but it generally is more effective at larger institutions, is the use of cluster hires, where rather than hiring minorities in singles, where they feel isolated and they have a hard time adjusting to a climate, you do a cluster hire where several departments or schools get together and they hire a cohort of minorities together, and they set up programs where they can feel that they are a group that can bond together, and they have ways for them to feel that they can build their own inclusive environment. And I've seen that work very effectively.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and speakers again. And thank you all for your participation and your great questions. And I hope that you will take advantage of the other opportunities throughout the rest of the meeting this week that touch on these topics that are really important. Thank you for your attention.
Tell us, I really say hi. I really enjoyed it.